For decades, standard history taught us that the turning point of the Pacific War was a matter of raw industrial muscle, that America simply outproduced the enemy. But history suggests a far more chilling reality. In early 1942, the skies belonged to a ghost. The Mitsubishi Zero was so devastatingly agile that American pilots truly believed it defied the laws of aerodynamics. Engaging one in a dogfight was a certified death sentence. But the ultimate vulnerability of the Japanese Empire didn't unravel in a high-tech laboratory or a massive factory bombing. It began with a single million-to-one shot that forced a 19-year-old Imperial pilot to make a fatal, calculated risk over a desolate patch of Alaskan mud. What he left behind wasn't just a crashed plane.
Many of us remember the stories our fathers told us about the early days of the war
British
in the
and
Pacific.
American engineers
It was a
used to
time of
turn the
pure,
samurai's
unadulterated
masterpiece
vulnerability
into a
for the United States.
flaming target.
In the spring of
This is the
1942,
story of the ghost
skies
plane
over the
that won
Pacific
the
did
war,
not belong
and the
to us.
grand illusion
They belonged
that
to a
plunged over the
ghost.
Pacific.
More specifically, they belonged to the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. To the young American Wildcats and P-40 Warhawk pilots who went up against it, the Zero did not feel like a machine made of aluminum and rivets. It felt like an act of sorcery. It could outclimb anything we had, outturn anything we built, and vanish into the clouds before a tail gunner could even line up a sight. Rumors began to circulate through the ranks, whispered over lukewarm coffee in the mess halls of dynamic carriers. The rumor was simple, terrifying, and seemingly absolute. The Japanese had engineered a fighter plane that defied the very laws of aerodynamics. But history suggests that every myth of engineering invincibility has a single hidden point of failure. The ultimate vulnerability of the Japanese Empire's aerial strategy did not begin with a massive factory bombing or a breakthrough in a high-tech laboratory. It began with a patch of deceptively soft, gray volcanic mud on a desolate, windswept rock called Akutan Island. To understand how a single aircraft could trick an entire empire's air corps, we have to look at the sheer desperation of June 1942. The Japanese Imperial Navy, fresh off their triumphs at Pearl Harbor and Wake Island, were executing a massive dual-pronged offensive. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto launched a diversionary strike up north in the frozen Aleutian Islands of Alaska, hoping to draw the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet away from his true, catastrophic target, Midway Atoll.
Part of this northern strike force was a 19-year-old flight petty officer named Tadayoshi Koga. Koga was flying the crown jewel of the Imperial fleet, a pristine, carrier-borne Zero fighter, serial number 4593. He believed, as he had been trained to believe, that his aircraft was an extension of the Emperor's will, completely flawless and utterly untouchable by the industrial hands of the Western powers. But the harsh reality of naval warfare is that geography carries very little for Imperial pride. During a raid on Dutch Harbor, Koga's Zero took a single golden BB, a stray round of small arms ground fire that severed the plane's oil line. The pristine engine began to choke on its own lifeblood. Therefore, Koga realized he could not make the long flight back to his carrier, the Ryujo. He was forced to clear his flight path and look for an emergency landing strip on Akutan Island, a place designated by Japanese intelligence as a safe, flat sanctuary for downed pilots. Looking down from his cockpit, the flat terrain resembled a solid, grassy meadow. But here is where the grand illusion began to unravel. The meadow was actually a treacherous, bottomless peat bog. The moment Koga's heavy landing gear struck the surface, the tires did not roll. They sank instantly into the primeval muck. The sudden, violent friction acted like a massive tripwire. The 5,000-pound fighter flipped completely upside down in a spectacular spray of black mud, snapping Koga's neck instantly. The crown jewel of Japan's Air Force was now inverted, half buried in the Alaskan wilderness, perfectly intact. Because of this single landing error, a priceless piece of military technology sat waiting in the quiet fog. But the Japanese military did not know the plane survived the flip. Their doctrine assumed that a crash in such terrain would completely obliterate the lightweight aircraft. They assumed no Western eyes would ever look upon its engineering secrets.
That single, silent assumption in the mud of Akutan Island would become the foundational trick that allowed American engineers to systematically dismantle the myth of the samurai plane, turning the Zero from an object of American terror into a predictable target in the skies over Midway and Guadalcanal. Many of us who have spent a lifetime tinkering in workshops or admiring classical manufacturing know a fundamental truth. True engineering genius often comes from radical, uncompromising choices. In the late 1930s, the Japanese Imperial Navy issued a challenge to its domestic aviation industry that most Western engineers considered completely laughable. They wanted a carrier-borne fighter that could fly faster than 310 miles per hour, climb to 10,000 feet in under 4 minutes, and possess a cruising range that would allow it to cover the vast, empty distances of the Pacific Theater. Most importantly, it had to outmaneuver any land-based fighter in existence. To the traditionalists at Boeing, Grumman, or Supermarine, this sounded like a mathematical impossibility. If you build a plane with a massive engine and heavy armor to survive dogfights, you lose your agility and your range. If you build it light, it becomes a fragile flying coffin. Western designers chose the path of safety, wrapping their pilots in heavy steel plating and installing self-sealing fuel tanks.
But Japan's chief designer at Mitsubishi, a brilliant young engineer named Jiro Horikoshi, chose a completely different, almost fanatical path. He did not look at the problem through the lens of Western industrial might. He approached it with the mindset of a samurai swordsmith forging a katana. Every single ounce of excess weight was treated as an existential enemy to be systematically eliminated. Therefore, Horikoshi made a radical compromise that would later change the entire trajectory of the air war. He utilized a top-secret, ultra-light aluminum alloy developed by the Sumitomo Metal Industries called Extra Super Duralumin. It was incredibly strong, yet remarkably light. To save even more weight, Horikoshi did something that shocked contemporary aviation experts. He built the wings completely integrated into the fuselage structure itself. The plane wasn't a collection of bolted-together parts. It was a single, continuous aerodynamic sculpture. But this obsessive pursuit of lightness required a dark, fatal trade-off that the Imperial Navy willingly accepted. To make the Zero a masterpiece of agility, Horikoshi stripped away every single piece of protective armor for the pilot. He omitted the heavy armored glass behind the windshield, and he completely left out the rubberized self-sealing layers inside the fuel tanks. To the Japanese military command, a pilot's best defense was a flawless offense. If your plane could outturn anything in the sky, you simply shouldn't be in a position to get shot at in the first place. The result of this uncompromising design philosophy was the Mitsubishi A6M, which officially entered service in 1940, the year of the Japanese Empire's 2600th anniversary, from which the aircraft took its legendary name, the Type Zero, or simply the Zero. When it first appeared in the skies over China, Western intelligence agencies completely dismissed the reports. They looked at the performance specs forwarded by eyewitnesses and concluded that the numbers had to be an exaggeration. They believed Asian industry was only capable of producing cheap, third-rate copies of European designs. Many of our military leaders at the time fell into the dangerous trap of underestimating an adversary. Consequently, when the hammer dropped on December 7, 1941, the United States was caught completely flat-footed by a machine they didn't believe could exist. The Zero didn't just meet its design requirements, it shattered them. Powered by a relatively modest 14-cylinder Nakajima Sakai engine, its lightweight frame gave it a power-to-weight ratio that made it climb like a rocket ship. Its massive, unducted ailerons gave it a turning radius so tight that an American pilot attempting to follow a Zero into a horizontal loop would instantly stall out or rip the wings right off his own aircraft.
Furthermore, the Zero possessed an operational range of over 1,900 miles. To put that into perspective for anyone who understands the logistics of aerial warfare, that was more than double the range of the early British Supermarine Spitfire or the American Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. It allowed the Imperial Navy to launch devastating fighter sweeps from land bases or carriers that were hundreds of miles beyond where American commanders thought it was safe to park an airfield. It gave the Japanese the ultimate luxury in warfare, the ability to dictate exactly when, where, and how the battle would begin. But the sheer tactical shock of the Zero went far beyond its mechanical specifications. It became a profound psychological weapon. In the early months of 1942, As Wake Island, the Philippines, and Singapore fell in rapid succession, the Zero cultivated an aura of supernatural invincibility. American pilots, flying the rugged, heavy Grumman F-4F Wildcat, quickly realized that engaging a Zero in a classic close-quarters dogfight was an absolute death sentence. If you tried to turn with it, the Zero would effortlessly slip behind your tail within 2 rotations and shred your fuselage with its dual 20mm wing cannons. History shows that when a military force begins to believe their enemy possesses an unbeatable weapon, the battle is often half lost before the first shot is fired. American pilots were returning from missions with their spirits completely broken, telling stories of a plane that could seemingly hover in midair, reverse direction on a dime, and shrug off machine gun bursts by simply vanishing into the clouds. The Zero had become the ultimate symbol of Imperial Japan's unstoppable march across the globe. Therefore, the Allied High Command faced a desperate, existential crisis. They knew that unless they could capture a pristine, working model of this mysterious fighter to dissect its engineering secrets, they would be forced to fight a war of blind attrition. They needed to find a flaw, a hidden fracture line in the samurai's armor. But because Japanese pilots were fiercely dedicated to their Bushido code, they would deliberately crash their damaged planes into the sea or use them as weapons of suicide rather than allow them to fall into enemy hands. The secrets of the Imperial masterpiece remained locked tight behind a wall of fanatical devotion and absolute aerial dominance, leaving the Americans to wonder if the ghost in the sky would ever show its true face.
For those who lived through the anxieties of 1942 or have studied the maps of that vast ocean, it is clear that the Pacific War was fundamentally a war of distances. After the devastation at Pearl Harbor, the United States was clinging to a thin lifeline. Our aircraft carriers had miraculously escaped destruction on December 7th, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and constantly hunted by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's triumphant fleet. The American military command knew that a single major strategic misstep would open the entire west coast of the United States to direct Japanese bombardment. But Yamamoto faced a different kind of pressure. He understood that Japan's industrial capacity was a mere fraction of America's. If the United States was given 2 or 3 years to fully spool up its massive factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh, the sheer volume of American ships and planes would eventually overwhelm the island nation. Therefore, Yamamoto needed a decisive, catastrophic battle to draw out the remaining American carriers and sink them once and for all. He chose a tiny, isolated coral atoll known as Midway. To ensure the trap succeeded, however, Yamamoto engineered a massive diversionary campaign far to the north. He detached a powerful task force to strike the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, launching air raids on the American base at Dutch Harbor. He calculated that when Washington saw Japanese forces invading American soil in Alaska, they would hysterically split their meager carrier forces, rushing ships north and leaving Midway completely exposed. It was a brilliant chess move on paper, but military history teaches us that even the most meticulous plans are entirely dependent on the frailties of weather, radio waves, and human split-second decisions.
Consequently, the fog-shrouded skies over the Aleutians became the backdrop for a frantic, invisible race. On June 3, 1942, the Japanese carriers Ryujo and Junyo emerged from the northern mists and launched their strike groups against Dutch Harbor. Among the waves of roaring bombers was 19-year-old Tadayoshi Koga, flying his pristine Mitsubishi Zero. As Koga pressed his attack through the anti-aircraft fire, his primary mission was not merely to destroy buildings, it was to maintain absolute air supremacy and protect the slower Japanese bombers from any American fighters that might rise to challenge them. But the Americans at Dutch Harbor were not as helpless as the Imperial Navy assumed. Despite the freezing fog and primitive radar tracking, U.S. Army P-40 Warhawks and Navy Wildcats scrambled into the fray. A chaotic, close-quarters dogfight erupted amidst the jagged, snow-capped volcanic peaks. Koga, utilizing the astonishing agility of his Zero, easily maneuvered behind an American fighter. He pulled the trigger, his 20mm cannons hammering through the fuselage of his target. But as he swung his aircraft around for another pass, a stray, low-caliber machine gun bullet fired from the ground nicked his aircraft. It was a 1,000,000-to-1 shot. The bullet didn't hit the pilot, nor did it strike the ammunition drums. Instead, it neatly severed the small oil return line located between the oil cooler and the Nakajima Sakai engine. To any mechanic, the consequence of a severed oil line is immediate and catastrophic. Within moments, the pressure gauge in Koga's cockpit dropped to zero, and a thick, dark stream of engine oil began to spray across the canopy, obscuring his vision. The mechanical masterpiece was suddenly operating on borrowed time. Koga knew that if his engine seized over the freezing, hyperboreal waters of the Bering Sea, he would die of hypothermia within minutes of hitting the water.
Therefore, he broke formation and radioed his flight leader, signaling that he was attempting an emergency landing. Imperial Navy protocol for the Aleutian campaign was incredibly strict. If a pilot was forced down on enemy territory, they were to destroy their aircraft completely to prevent the technology from falling into American hands. If a pilot was too badly injured to do so, his wingmen were explicitly ordered to destroy the downed plane with their own machine guns. But Japanese intelligence had designated Akutan Island, a desolate, uninhabited rock a few miles away, as a safe emergency extraction point. A Japanese submarine was already patrolling just offshore, specifically tasked with rescuing any pilots who managed to put their planes down on the island's wide, flat interior. Koga's wingmen, flying close behind his smoking fighter, watched as he lined up his approach toward what looked like a smooth, solid green field. They believed their young comrade would slide to a safe stop, set fire to his aircraft using his cockpit emergency flares, and walk down to the beach to await the rescue sub. But the treacherous Alaskan geography had laid a perfect trap. The seemingly flat field was actually a deceptive peat bog, a deep morass of waterlogged moss and volcanic mud that possessed the consistency of quicksand. As Koga lowered his landing gear and brought the Zero down at nearly 80 miles per hour, he was completely unaware that he was committing a fatal tactical error. Normally, a pilot forced to land on soft ground or water will keep his landing gear retracted, choosing to belly land the aircraft to distribute the weight evenly. But Koga, perhaps distracted by the blinding oil on his windshield or strictly following his carrier training, kept his heavy three-point landing gear extended. The heavy rubber tires touched the bog. They didn't skip or slide. They dug deep into the mud, acting like a massive, instantaneous brake on the bottom of the aircraft. The tremendous forward momentum of the 5,000-pound fighter had nowhere to go. The Zero violently pitched forward, its nose slamming into the earth, and flipped completely upside down in a massive explosion of black mud and tearing aluminum. The impact was short, sharp, and brutal. The sudden rotational force snapped Koga's neck, killing him instantly. His wingmen, circling anxiously above in the gray fog, looked down at the inverted wreckage. From their altitude, the plane appeared heavily damaged, partially buried, and completely lifeless. They saw no movement, and they assumed the violent flip had crushed the cockpit and destroyed the airframe beyond any hope of recovery. Furthermore, they could hear the frantic radio chatter from their carriers down south. The main fleet was already moving out, and their fuel needles were dropping dangerously low. They faced an agonizing choice: stay and spend precious ammunition trying to detonate a plane that already looked like a mangled pile of junk, or return to the Rujo before their own engines sputtered out over the ocean. Believing the secrets of the Zero were safely buried in the mud and ruin of Akutan Island, the wingmen turned their silver noses back toward the fleet. They left the ghost plane alone in the fog, completely unaware that this single decision would render Yamamoto's grand diversion at Midway entirely moot, altering the balance of naval aviation history forever. When we look back at the critical turning points of the war in the Pacific, it becomes clear that history is often written by the choices made in a fraction of a second. Young men, barely out of high school, were handed the keys to the most sophisticated killing machines of their era and expected to make flawless, strategic decisions under extreme duress. Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga was exactly one of these men. At just 19 years old, he was already considered an elite aviator, a product of Japan's notoriously brutal and selective naval flight training program. He was a pilot who didn't just fly the Zero, he lived through it.
But on that freezing morning of June 4th, 1942, as he flew over the jagged coast of Alaska, Koga was operating under a highly rigid, unyielding military doctrine. Imperial Japan's Bushido Code did not tolerate defeat, and it certainly did not accommodate the concept of becoming a prisoner of war. Pilots were taught that their lives were as light as a feather compared to the heavy weight of their duty to the emperor. If your plane was compromised, you had two choices: Find a way to strike the enemy in a final suicidal burst of glory, or ensure your machine was completely obliterated so its design secrets died with you. Therefore, when that single ground-fired bullet severed Koga's oil line during the raid on Dutch Harbor, a cold, calculated countdown began in his cockpit. He could see the dark, viscous engine oil bubbling out from the cowling, splattering across the pristine cockpit glass. The sweet, metallic stench of burning oil and overheating aluminum began to fill the small space. He checked his gauges. The oil pressure needle was dropping like a stone. Koga knew his Nakajima Sakai engine would seize completely within minutes. To his left and right, his two wingmen, Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Tsuguo Shikata, pulled their Zeros in close. They could see the black streak of fluid painting the belly of Koga's aircraft. They were waiting for him to make his choice. If Koga decided to dive into an American anti-aircraft emplacement on the shores of Dutch Harbor, they would follow him down to witness his sacrifice. If he chose to try and stretch the distance back to the aircraft carrier Regio, they would escort him until his engine gave out over the frigid Bering Sea. But Koga chose a third option, a calculated risk based on a piece of critical intelligence provided to him before the mission. Imperial Command had explicitly designated a small, horseshoe-shaped island named Akutan as an official emergency landing zone. They had told the pilots that if they were forced down, a Japanese submarine would be idling in the shadows of the island's bay, ready to send a motorized rubber boat to the beach to rescue them. To a young man with his entire life ahead of him, the prospect of survival, a warm meal on a submarine, and a return to the skies to fight another day was an incredibly powerful motivator.
Consequently, Koga made the fateful decision to head for Akutan Island. He throttled back his dying engine, trying to preserve every single stroke of the pistons as the aircraft glided through the low-hanging fog. His wingmen followed him, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of American interception. As Akutan materialized out of the gray mist, Koga spotted a wide, long stretch of green terrain in the island's interior. From a few hundred feet up, it looked like a perfect, natural grass runway, smooth, unobstructed, and gently sloping. But here is where Koga's calculated risk turned into a fatal miscalculation. The intelligence maps provided by the Japanese military were severely flawed. They had mapped the island from high-altitude aerial reconnaissance photographs taken months prior. To a camera lens thousands of feet in the air, the deep, waterlogged peat bogs of the Alaskan tundra look identical to a solid, grassy meadow. Koga was looking at a geological illusion. Furthermore, Koga made a tactical decision during his final approach that went against standard emergency landing procedures. In a typical forced landing on unknown, soft terrain or water, a pilot will keep his landing gear retracted. A belly landing allows the smooth, flat underside of the fuselage to slide across the surface, distributing the impact forces and keeping the plane upright. It damages the propeller and the engine, but it almost always allows the pilot to climb out of the cockpit shaken but alive. But Koga was flying an aircraft that he had been conditioned to protect at all costs. The Zero was a scarce, priceless commodity in the Imperial Navy, and its lightweight construction meant that a belly landing would severely deform the integrated wing and fuselage structure, rendering the plane a total loss. Perhaps he believed the ground was firm enough to support the aircraft. Perhaps he thought he could execute a textbook three-point landing, taxi to a stop, and leave the plane intact for a future salvage operation. Whatever his precise thought process, Koga reached down and pulled the mechanical lever to lower his heavy hydraulic landing gear. The silver struts locked into place. The Zero glided down over the edge of the bog, its speed dropping to roughly 80 miles per hour. Koga flared the aircraft beautifully, gently easing the tailwheel and the two main tires down onto the vibrant green surface.
But the instant the heavy rubber tires broke the surface of the grass, they didn't roll. They plunged deep into a thick, primeval soup of waterlogged moss and volcanic mud. The bog acted like an instantaneous, immovable concrete wall against the bottom of the wheels. The forward momentum of the 5,000-pound fighter was violently, catastrophically arrested. Therefore, the laws of pure physics took over. With the wheels trapped fast in the mud, the tail of the Zero ripped upward into the air. The plane did not skid, it violently cartwheeled forward, pitching completely upside down in a spectacular explosion of black mud, tearing metal and flying turf. The massive weight of the engine slammed downward into the earth, and the entire cockpit canopy was driven deep into the soft, yielding muck. The mechanical violence of the flip lasted only a second, but it was absolute. The sudden, whipping rotational force snapped Tadayoshi Koga's neck instantly, killing him before the muddy water could even seep into his flight suit. He remained trapped in his harness, inverted, suspended over the Alaskan soil he had sought to conquer. Up above, his wingmen, Endo and Shikata, circled the crash site in a slow, agonizing orbit. They looked down at the upside-down fighter. The landing gear was pointing helplessly toward the gray sky, caked in black peat. The fuselage appeared intact, but there was no movement from the cockpit. They clicked their radios, calling out Koga's name, but they were met only with static and the distant hum of their own engines. But remember, their orders were explicit. If a Zero goes down on enemy soil, you must destroy it. Shikata lined up his gun sight on the inverted wreckage, his fingers resting on the trigger of his 7.7mm machine guns. He was preparing to fire a burst into the fuel tanks to turn Koga's masterpiece into a raging inferno. But as he looked through his reticle, he hesitated. The plane was partially buried in a wet bog, surrounded by standing water. He knew that firing regular bullets into a wet, mud-soaked airframe might not spark a fire, and he was running dangerously low on ammunition. More importantly, he could see his fuel needle creeping toward the red danger zone. If he spent another 5 minutes circling and strafing the bog, neither he nor Endo would have enough fuel to make it back to the Ryujo. They would both suffer the exact same fate as their friend.
Believing that no human being could have survived that violent flip, and convinced that the treacherous mud would swallow the wreckage before the Americans could ever locate it, the two wingmen made a final, solemn sweep over the island. They turned their aircraft south, leaving Tadayoshi Koga alone in his silent silver tomb. It was a moment of profound human error, a calculated risk that failed, leaving a pristine piece of military technology sitting completely exposed, waiting for the enemy to come and claim its secrets. For nearly 5 weeks, the ghost plane of Akutan Island sat completely undisturbed in its cradle of black mud, guarded only by the freezing Aleutian winds and the low-hanging fog. The Japanese high command remained entirely confident that their technological masterpiece was safely buried forever. But history is full of small, mundane coincidences that completely shatter the grandest military illusions. On July 10, 1942, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina Timeland, piloted by Lieutenant William Thies, was conducting a routine anti-submarine patrol over Akutan Island. As Thies craned his aircraft through a rare break in the clouds, his eyes caught an unusual glint of metallic silver reflecting out of the dark peat bog below. Curious, he dropped his massive patrol plane down to investigation altitude. Looking through his binoculars, Thies couldn't believe his eyes. There, sitting upside down like a stranded whale in the muck, was a pristine, remarkably intact Japanese Zero. He carefully noted the exact coordinates on his map and rushed back to base. Within days, a top-secret U.S. Navy salvage team was dispatched to the island, wading chest-deep through the freezing mud to carefully upright the fighter, crate it in heavy wooden boxes, and ship it under intense guard straight to North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego, California. The arrival of the Akutan Zero in San Diego was treated with the kind of reverence usually reserved for a captured enemy general. The United States military knew that the secrets locked inside this 5,000-pound aluminum shell were paid for with the lives of hundreds of American boys, from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea.
Therefore, a team of elite Navy mechanics, aeronautical engineers, and metallurgists, led by the brilliant project commander, civilian engineer, were given an ultimatum. Take this machine apart, piece by piece, analyze every bolt, reverse engineer its performance, and find the fatal flaw that would allow our boys to shoot it down. The team worked in a highly secured, blacked-out hangar, operating around the clock under the watchful eyes of armed guards. They began by carefully washing away the dried Alaskan mud from the fuselage. As the grime cleared, the engineers were stunned by the sheer quality of the Japanese manufacturing. Many of our industrial leaders at the time believed the comforting wartime propaganda that Japanese factories were backward and only capable of producing cheap, brittle imitations. But as the mechanics began removing the exterior panels, that comforting illusion vanished into thin air. They discovered that the skin of the Zero wasn't made of standard aircraft aluminum. It was a highly advanced, ultralight zinc aluminum alloy known as extra super duralumin. It was thinner than anything American factories were rolling out, yet it possessed an astonishing tensile strength. But as the team dug deeper into the skeletal framework of the aircraft, they began to notice something highly peculiar about its construction, something that a traditional Western engineer would consider complete madness. Chief designer Jiro Horikoshi had built the wings completely integrated into the main fuselage structure. There were no heavy attachment bolts, no reinforced steel brackets, and no split joints. The entire airframe was a single, continuous, load-bearing unit. This meant the plane was phenomenally light and possessed an incredibly clean aerodynamic profile. But it also revealed a profound strategic vulnerability. Because the wings were part of the fuselage, if a Zero took a heavy hit that structurally deformed a wing spar, the entire aircraft was ruined beyond any hope of field repair. It could not be easily patched up on the deck of an aircraft carrier. It had to be completely scrapped. The real revelation, however, came when the mechanics opened up the wings to inspect the fuel system. In an American fighter, like the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, the fuel tanks were heavy, self-sealing rubber bladders. When an enemy bullet pierced an American tank, the specialized rubber would instantly swell up upon contact with the gasoline, sealing the hole and preventing a catastrophic fire.
But when the San Diego mechanics looked inside the Zero's wings, they found bare aluminum tanks built right against the outer skin of the wing. There was no rubber, there was no armor plating, there wasn't even a single sheet of fire-retardant material wrapping the volatile aviation fuel. The Japanese had deliberately traded the lives of their pilots for an extra few gallons of fuel capacity and a few pounds of weight savings. To the American engineering team, this was the first major fracture line in the samurai's armor. They realized that the Zero wasn't an invincible, supernatural ghost. It was a fragile glass cannon. If an American pilot could simply manage to get a single clean burst of machine gun fire into the wings, the entire aircraft would instantly erupt into a roaring inferno. Consequently, after weeks of painstaking inspection and meticulous reassembly, the team prepared for the ultimate test. They replaced the bent propeller, flushed out the salt water from the Nakashima Sakai engine, and tuned the carburetors to run on high-octane American fuel. On September 20th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders climbed into the cockpit of the captured Zero, pulled his goggles down, and cranked the engine to life. For the next several weeks, Sanders took the Zero up into the clear California skies, flying it in a series of grueling mock dogfights against every single fighter in the American inventory. Sanders pushed the Zero to its absolute limits. He climbed with it, dived with it, and rolled it until his eyes blurred from the G-forces. And as he flew, he systematically unraveled the exact aerodynamic laws that governed the machine. He discovered that at low speeds, under 200 miles per hour, the Zero was an absolute demon. It could turn on a dime, outclimb a Wildcat with effortless grace, and reverse its direction so quickly that no American pilot could hope to maintain a gun solution. But Sanders noticed that when he entered a steep dive and his airspeed crept up above 250 miles per hour, something dramatic happened to the Zero's legendary handling. The massive lightweight ailerons, the control surfaces on the wings that allow a plane to roll, began to freeze up under the immense pressure of the rushing air. The mechanical linkage became so incredibly heavy that it required two hands on the flight stick just to force the plane into a sluggish roll.
Furthermore, Sanders discovered a critical, bizarre quirk in the design of the Japanese carburetor. When he jammed the throttle forward and entered a sudden nose-down dive, the negative G-forces caused the fuel in the float bowl to slosh away from the feed needle. For a long, terrifying 2 seconds, the magnificent Nakajima engine would completely choke, cough, and lose all power before the fuel could redistribute. These precise, technical details were the keys to victory that the Allied High Command had been praying for. Sanders landed the Zero, walked into the briefing room, and sat down with a team of tactical planners. They didn't just have a captured plane, they had a complete blueprint of its limitations. They realized that the secret to beating the Zero wasn't trying to outfly it, It was forcing the Japanese pilots to play a completely different game. They wrote up a top-secret tactical manual and rushed it out to every single fighter squadron in the Pacific theater. The message was clear, direct, and authoritative. Never close-quarters dogfight a Zero. If a Zero gets on your tail, do not try to turn away. Instead, throw your plane into a high-speed vertical dive to the right. Your heavy American plane will outdive it, the Zero's controls will freeze up, its engine will sputter, and you will escape every single time. The mythical aura of the invincible samurai plane was officially dead, dismantled not by a bullet in the sky, but by the precise, calculating minds of American engineers working in the quiet hangars of San Diego.
For those young men sitting in the sweltering ready rooms of American aircraft carriers in late 1942, the arrival of a small, mimeographed tactical bulletin changed everything. For months, they had been told that the Mitsubishi Zero was an untouchable phantom. They had watched their comrades fall out of the sky in flames, victims of a machine that seemed to violate the basic principles of aviation. But history shows that the moment you strip away the mystery from a weapon, you strip away its power. Armed with the precise data gathered from the hangars of San Diego, American pilots didn't just change how they flew, they completely altered the psychological balance of the war. They realized that the legendary agility of the Zero wasn't a sign of superior industrial power. It was a desperate illusion built on extreme fragility. Therefore, when the next major clash erupted in the sky over Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, the Japanese pilots encountered a completely different kind of adversary. They were no longer fighting terrified boys who would panic and try to outturn them. Instead, they were facing cold, calculating tacticians who refused to play by the old rules. American pilots flying the rugged Grumman F-4F Wildcat now utilized a brilliant maneuver developed by naval aviator John Thatch, known simply as the Thatch Weave. Instead of engaging a Zero in a classic one-on-one horizontal dogfight, two American planes would fly in a wide parallel formation. When a Zero slipped behind one of the Wildcats, the two American fighters would turn sharply toward each other, crossing paths like a pair of scissors. This maneuver effectively forced the trailing Zero directly into the crosshairs of the opposite American pilot's heavy machine guns. Consequently, the fatal trade-offs made by Japanese designer Jiro Horikoshi were exposed in the most brutal manner imaginable. When those heavy American .50 caliber rounds struck the unarmored aluminum wings of the Zero, there were no self-sealing rubber bladders to stop the leaks, and no armor plating to protect the engine components. A single brief burst of fire was all it took. The pristine, silver masterpieces of the Imperial Navy didn't just take damage, they erupted into spectacular, blinding balls of orange fire, plunging straight down into the deep blue waters of the Pacific.
Furthermore, American pilots weaponized the technical flaws discovered during the high-speed testing in California. If a Zero managed to gain a tactical advantage, the American aviator didn't try to climb away or execute a tight loop. Instead, they slam the throttle forward and throw their heavy, armor-clad fighters into a steep, vertical dive to the right. To the Japanese pilots, this was a deeply frustrating development. They would attempt to follow the Americans into the dive, but as their airspeed surged past 250 miles per hour, they found themselves completely betrayed by their own machinery. The massive, lightweight ailerons on the Zero's wings froze solid under the immense aerodynamic pressure. The control stick became as stiff as a block of concrete, completely locking the pilot out of a quick roll. Even worse, the sudden transition into a negative G dive caused the primitive Japanese float carburetors to choke on their own fuel supply. The Nakajima Sakai engine would cough, sputter, and temporarily lose all horsepower at the exact moment the pilot needed it most. The American fighters would effortlessly pull ahead and escape, leaving the Imperial aviators stranded in a rigid, uncontrollable dive, completely unable to bring their weapons to bear. But the tragedy for the Imperial Japanese Navy went far deeper than the loss of their aircraft. The true, irreplaceable cost of Horikoshi's design philosophy was the systematic destruction of their elite pilot corps. Because the Zero provided absolutely zero protection for the human being sitting in the cockpit, a single stray bullet could instantly kill an aviator who had spent 4 years training in the arts of aerial warfare. Many of our own veteran pilots would return to their carriers with their fuselages caked in soot and filled with dozens of bullet holes, saved entirely by the heavy steel plates behind their seats and the thick armored glass of their windscreens. They could survive a mistake, learn from it, and fly again the next day. The Japanese pilots were never given that luxury. When a Zero was hit, the pilot almost always died with it.
Therefore, by the time the calendar turned to 1943, the thin, fragile crust of Japan's elite naval aviation had been completely worn away. The grand illusion that had begun with such spectacular triumph over Pearl Harbor was rapidly unraveling. The skies over the Pacific were no longer filled with legendary aces. They were increasingly populated by young, poorly trained conscripts who were handed the keys to an obsolete aircraft and expected to perform miracles. They were still flying the exact same Mitsubishi Zero that had dominated the war in 1941, but the Americans had already moved on. The United States industrial machine was now delivering the next generation of carrier fighters, the massive, roaring Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the gull-winged Vought F-4U Corsair. These new machines were explicitly engineered around the vulnerabilities discovered from the Akutan Zero. They possessed massive 2,000 horsepower engines, heavy armor, and overwhelming firepower. They could outclimb, outdive, and outgun the Zero at every single altitude. History suggests that the ultimate failure of the samurai plane was a failure of adaptation. The Japanese military command had become so blinded by their early successes and so utterly convinced of the spiritual superiority of their pilots that they saw no need to fundamentally redesign their premier fighter. They continued to send the Zero into battle, completely oblivious to the fact that their enemy had already spent months studying its skeleton, calculating its limits, and teaching every single American boy exactly how to destroy it. The great illusion had vanished, replaced by the cold, industrial reality of an empire that had been completely outfought by a team of mechanics working in the quiet twilight of a California hangar. Many of us who look back at the grand architecture of the Second World War tend to focus on the massive industrial statistics, the thousands of Liberty ships launched, the endless lines of B-24 bombers rolling off the assembly lines in Michigan, or the sheer weight of American steel. It is comforting to believe that raw numbers alone decide the fates of empires. But history suggests a more subtle, profound truth. The most decisive weapon in any conflict is not the one that strikes the hardest, but the one that strips the enemy of his ability to surprise you. The captured Mitsubishi Zero from Akutan Island did not drop a single bomb, nor did it ever fire a shot in anger under the American flag. Yet, it remains one of the most consequential intelligence windfalls in the entire history of modern warfare.
Admiral Minichi Koga, who took command of the Japanese combined fleet after Yamamoto's death, later made a stunning admission regarding the loss of that single fighter in the Alaskan mud. He stated that Japan's ultimate defeat in the Pacific Air War did not begin with the introduction of the Hellcat or the Corsair. It began the moment the Americans captured serial number 4593. He went so far as to say that the discovery of the Akutan Zero was a blow equal in strategic magnitude to the loss of an entire fleet of aircraft carriers at Midway. Therefore, we must view that inverted aircraft not merely as a piece of salvaged wreckage, but as a silent catalyst that completely rewrote the rules of engagement. Before its capture, American naval aviation was locked in a state of psychological paralysis, treating the Zero as a supernatural phantom that defied the laws of physics. But the moment American engineers stripped away its silver skin and exposed its bare aluminum bones in San Diego, the Phantom was reduced to a set of predictable performance curves and critical design flaws. We didn't just learn how to shoot down a plane, we learned how to systematically dismantle an entire military doctrine built on the myth of invincibility. Consequently, the legacy of Tadayoshi Koga's fatal calculated risk reverberated through every major aerial campaign that followed. When the massive carrier battles of 1944 erupted, most notably the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the results were so staggeringly lopsided that American pilots famously dubbed the engagement the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single afternoon, over 300 Japanese aircraft were swept from the sky with minimal American losses. The young men flying the new Grumman Hellcats weren't guessing how to survive an encounter with a Zero.
They knew exactly when the Japanese engine would sputter, exactly at what speed the enemy's controls would freeze, and exactly where to aim their machine guns to ignite the unarmored wing tanks. The Grand Samurai masterpiece had been transformed into a flying target, outdated and entirely exposed.
It is a striking irony of history that a machine engineered with such fanatical devotion to secrecy, built by an empire that preferred suicide over surrender, became the very instrument that accelerated its downfall. The Japanese pilots continued to fly the Zero with the same fierce bravery they had shown at the start of the war, completely unaware that their enemy had already memorized every fracture line in their armor. The ghost plane of Akutan Island had done its job perfectly. It remained in the United States after the war, a silent testament to the power of precise engineering and tactical intelligence over raw, unyielding pride. And for those of us who appreciate the quiet, invisible turning points of history, it serves as an enduring reminder. The greatest illusions of strength are often buried in the shallowest mud, just waiting for someone to come along, clean off the grime, and look at the truth inside. History isn't just about the machines we built or the battles we won. It's about preserving the hard truths and the incredible stories that define our heritage. If you appreciate this deep, unfiltered look into the turning points of the Second World War, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps ensure these stories continue to reach those who value them most. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Did your fathers or grandfathers ever share their stories about the Zero, or do you remember the anxiety of those early Pacific campaigns? Let's keep that history alive together. Finally, if you have a friend, a fellow veteran, or a son who needs to hear this story, please share this video with them. Thank you for your time today, and welcome to the community.